to the crash course on the history of Israel and Zionism that is being offered to us today by Hasbara Fellowships and Pearl Gasner, who is in Ontario, not here in Winnipeg. Hasbara Fellowships is an organization that provides learning about Israel and the history of Israel, the politics. I'm going to let Pearl give you a more in-depth explanation. For those of you who took the Hebrew class at Congregation Shaarey Zedek, the word Hasbara comes from lehasbir, to explain. And it's really to help explain and give background. Now, the purpose of the course that we had last week and this week is really, it's a 101. It's really a basic starting point. And Pearl will explain this also a little bit later. Many of you asked a lot of questions and were wondering why we didn't talk about this or that or more in-depth information last time. But this is really a jump off point for you to know that these things actually exist and to let you know that we will provide more in-depth courses. But we felt that it was necessary now to offer something intense and fairly comprehensive to give you a big picture, especially with what we're seeing in the media. So this is just the beginning, and we will be offering more. Once again, our partners today are Hasbara Fellowships, Congregation Shaarey Zedek, Congregation Chayim, Herzlia, Adas Yeshurun, and Temple Shalom, as well as Jewish Federation with their young adult division and Hillel for Jewish students. So with no further ado, I will sign off to you, Pearl.
All right, thank you so much, Rena. Hi, everyone. Nice to see all of you again. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to start sharing my screen in a moment, but just to kind of recap a little bit from the last time, or I guess in case anyone wasn't at the last session, I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. I run the high school division of Hasbara Fellowships Canada. We are a student Israel advocacy organization, so we teach high school and college and university students how to support Israel on campus and how to fight against anti-Semitism. So what we are covering today and last week is a crash course in Israeli history. As Rena mentioned, it is a crash course. We are covering over 3,000 years of history in just under 2 hours. So unfortunately, this could be a full, year-long course, and we would be able to go into much more detail. Right now, I'm trying to just provide kind of snippets of the essential information that we need to know about in order to, put the things that we're reading into context and be able to kind of have educated discussions with other people about Israel and about Israeli history. So of course, I'm always happy if there are things that you think, should have been mentioned or that you're curious about that I didn't get to. I'm of course happy to answer. Please put your questions in the chat as we're going through and we'll answer them at the end. Just a couple of, or I guess I'm going to start sharing now actually, and then we will continue. I'll start by answering a few questions from the last session. Okay. So here we are, we have our crash course, and this is a little bit about us. So just, I guess, before we start out, so there was one comment that was sent in after that was kind of relating to, we spoke about how the land came to be under Jewish ownership. And last time we spoke about how there were Jewish organizations and individuals and philanthropists who basically organized land purchases from absentee landowners this was mainly at the time of the Ottoman Empire, for those of you who remember. So it was around the 1800s, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, when this really picked up. And as someone pointed out, that's not the only way that land was transferred to Jewish, to be kind of under Jewish ownership, I guess. So the land that was privately owned by local Arabs or by absentee landlords, that was purchased by Jews if it came under Jewish ownership. Some of them retained ownership of their land and still own it to this day. But if it was purchased and came under Jewish ownership, it was purchased by Jewish people or organizations. There was also public land, so land that had just been under the Ottoman Empire and then came under the British Empire, and that then came under the was transferred over to the Jewish state. So there were kind of two ways there. And the other question that I wanted to address relates to the Peel Commission. So we're going to skip ahead. So as you remember, last time we finished off talking about the UN partition plan, and we're going to transition now into talking about 1948 and what happened since then, since Israel's founding. But before that, we are going to go back a little bit, 10 years earlier, because based on, this is something I kind of skipped over again for the purposes of time, but based on some of the questions, I realized that, we should be covering this. So some of the questions were relating to, what if there had been a two-state solution proposed earlier on? Would that have led to peace? Would that have, made everyone happy? So I want to just talk quickly about the Peel Commission. And this was a commission, an organization from the British. This was during the British Mandate period when the British were in charge of the region. And there was a lot of Arab rioting, a lot of kind of violent uprisings. And the British were trying to figure out what to do as a result of the fighting between Jewish and Arab locals. And so they established a commission, the Peel Commission, to investigate the Arab rioting and figure out, they were rioting against the British as well, and figure out what to do about it. And they came up with a recommendation of partitioning the land. And what you see on the right is a map of the proposed partition. So there was going to be, the pink would become an Arab state, and the blue would be the Jewish state. And as you can see, the Jewish state is tiny. We know that Israel alone is already extremely small. And we also spoke last time about how originally the British mandate for Palestine and what was going to be the Jewish national home would include all of Jordan. Then it was shrunk down to just be this whole kind of area here. And then the Peel Commission proposed to shrink it even further. And as we can see, the Arabs were offered a large proportion of the land. And they rejected this plan. They were not accepting of this. The Jewish leadership was kind of mixed. Some were saying, we have no other option. If this is what we're going to get, then it's better than nothing. And others said, absolutely not. This is way too small, and this is not what we were promised. So it was kind of mixed on the Jewish side. But I do think it's important to realize that, the fact that the Arab leadership said no even to this plan kind of, brings into question the validity of saying, well, if they would have been offered to share the land from the beginning, then there would be peace. So I just wanted to kind of go back and bring up the Peel Commission, because I thank you to those who brought it up. I think it is important. So that was in 1937. And we already spoke about 1947, the UN partition plan, which again was accepted by the Jewish people and rejected by the Arab leadership. And that is where we left off. So now we're going to be starting new material going forward. And please don't forget, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we will do our best to answer all of them at the end. So in 1948, on May 14th, the day after the British mandate, or really the day that the British mandate officially ended, the British left what was mandatory Palestine, and they basically just they pulled out, and Israel established their own independence on that day. It was on a Friday afternoon in Tel Aviv. For anyone who's been there and been to Independence Hall, that's where Ben-Gurion basically declared Israel's independence. And that was on a Friday afternoon, as I said. The next day, on Shabbat, Israel was attacked by the armies of 5 surrounding countries. You can see them over here. They had big, strong, well-equipped armies. Israel, on the other hand, was a country with a one-day-old country with 600,000 Jewish citizens. Many of them were Holocaust survivors or refugees from Arab lands, and they were facing off against five major Arab armies. The war was very difficult. About 6,000 Israelis died at this time. That was 1% of the population, which is obviously very significant as far as numbers, as well as the fact that it was, 6,000 individual people. And around this time, about 500,000 Arabs fled the country at the time of the war, shortly before or during. There are a lot of kind of disputes and different understandings over why they left. And I think there's sort of a combination of true answers. So some left because they didn't want to be caught in the crossfires of a war, which, is understandable, especially kind of the wealthier people who could afford to, pick up and go somewhere else. A lot of them assumed that the Arab world was going to win this war, so they would be able to return back once the war was over and the land was in Arab ownership or became an Arab state, whatever was going to happen to it if they won. Some of them were forced to leave, especially in villages or kind of communities that were sympathetic to the Arab side of the war and that were actually fighting against the Jews. The War of Independence sort of unofficially started a few months before Israel declared independence. There had already been a lot of fighting with local Arabs and even with Jordanians coming in to help. So some people were forced to leave by the Israelis if they were considered to be enemies of the state. And some left, just out of fear, thinking that they would be forced to leave. So they wanted to just leave out of their own accord, even though there was no, in Israel's Declaration of Independence, it does guarantee equality and safety for all citizens and for all people who were living in the country. And those Arabs who stayed did become Israeli citizens. That's why today Israel's population is about 20% Arab. So that is, when people say, oh, all of the Arabs were kicked out at the time, that doesn't really make sense, because then how is there a 20% Arab population today? Where did they come from? So I do think that is important to note. And after the war, once Israel was basically secure, which wasn't sure before, if you can see over here, this quote from the Secretary of the Arab League at the time, which is sort of the body of the major Arab countries, he said, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre." So the goal of this war was clear. It was to exterminate the Jews from the country, to massacre them. And that, unfortunately, is what happened to many of the Jewish communities who didn't succeed in kind of their individual battles against the Arabs. But once the Jews won the war, and we'll speak about that in the next slide, Jewish immigration increased exponentially once we were kind of, secure in our existence. So Jewish people from around the world started flocking to make their lives in Israel. And what happened? So we did win the war, but that doesn't mean that there weren't. We didn't win the whole land. So as you can see over here, this was what we've already seen, the UN partition plan. So when Israel declared independence, it was declaring it in the blue part. They did end up gaining territory in the War of Independence. So everything that's blue on the right is what was under Israel's control after the war. And what you can see, though, is that certain parts of the country or of the area were taken over by neighboring countries. So what you can see over here in pink was taken over by Jordan. This is what's sometimes referred to as the West Bank, because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. It's the name they gave to it. Or as Judea and Samaria, which is the ancient biblical name for the area. This, in 1949, at the end of the war, came under Jordanian control. And over here, the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian control. The West Bank or Judea and Samaria, I'll use them kind of interchangeably. They were annexed by Jordan. So Jordan actually applied their sovereignty here and turned it into a part of Jordan, which under kind of the conventional understanding of international law of conquest, this is not something that can be done if a country is on the offensive side of a war. If they are the attackers, they are not allowed to keep land that they gained in that war. So Jordan's annexation of application of sovereignty in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria was never really accepted by the international community. Only 2 countries actually kind of recognized it, but most didn't really want to get involved, so they sort of ignored it. They didn't say, yes, you have the rights of this land, but they also didn't really condemn it. And when they took over, they didn't allow Jewish people. So Jordan was in control of this land from 1948 until 1967, as we'll get to on the next slide. But in all of that time, they did not allow Jewish people into the old city. We were not allowed to pray at the Western Wall, at the Kotel, as someone mentioned earlier, as being, the most significant and holiest site to Judaism. We were not allowed in. Jewish sites, Jewish cemeteries, synagogues were destroyed by the Jordanians while they were in control. Jews who lived there were allowed to, they were either killed, as we said, some of them were massacred, or else they were kicked out. They were not allowed to stay in the area. And as I said, Egypt took control of Gaza. They never sort of claimed it as theirs forever, but they did hold control of it. But Israel did gain land as well in the north and in the south. So, and that was basically how things stood pretty much until 1967. This is the Six-Day War. And again, this is a crash course. So there were other conflicts in between and after. Unfortunately, I just don't have time to get to every single one of them. So I'm trying to pick the ones that had the most significance in terms of the things that we're seeing in the media, the things that people are saying about Israel. I'm trying to keep it very specific to that. So for our purposes, the next conflict that we're going to discuss is the Six-Day War. And since 1948, the losing Arab countries had been kind of plotting their comeback, right? They still wanted the destruction of the Jewish state. They weren't okay with the fact that they had lost the war of 1948. And in May of 1967, the Egyptian president, first of all, there were a few things that happened kind of leading up to this war. One of the conditions at the end of the 1948 war, which really ended in 1949, the War of Independence, was that UN peacekeeping troops would be stationed in the Sinai Desert between Israel and Jordan. So if we go back, so over here we have Egypt, and the Sinai Desert is kind of over here in between the two. There were UN peacekeeping troops there to keep the peace. But the Egyptian president at the time kicked out all of those peacekeeping forces. He told them to leave, and they left. So, it's the only reason why you would kick out peacekeeping forces is if you don't want to be at peace. So that was one thing that happened leading up to the Six-Day War. Another is that the Egyptian president closed off Israel's access to the Strait of Tiran, which was Israel's, the access point from Eilat to kind of the international waterway. And he did not allow any Israeli ships or ships coming to Israel in or out. And again, that's right down here by Eilat. And according to the international laws of war, this is called a cause of war, an act of war, meaning even though Egypt didn't, fire a gun or shoot a rocket or anything like that, by blocking off another country's access to international waters, that is considered an act of starting a war because it's an attempt at economic strangulation. And so because of that, Israel was pretty clear on what was about to happen. They had officially, started a war by blocking off their waterway. They were also bringing troops to the border towards Israel. They had kicked out the UN peacekeeping troops. And so Israel launched preemptive strikes where they wiped out the Egyptian Air Force, pretty much the entire thing before Egypt even had kind of figured out what was happening. There's a good video online. I think it's called 6 Days of Miracles, which basically explains the first day of the 6-day war and all of the crazy things that happened that allowed Israel to have this major success that we're going to see. But basically, it started out with Israel preemptively launching this attack, this strike against Egypt's Air Force, which put them immediately at a major advantage. They actually begged Jordan not to get involved in the war. They said to Jordan, who, remember, Jordan was occupying the West Bank or Judea and Samaria area. And Israel said to them, if you don't get involved in this war, if you leave it between us and Egypt, we will not enter. We will not do anything. We won't involve you. But Jordan had signed a pact with Egypt, as had Syria. So all three countries got involved in this attack against Israel. We can see again from these quotes from the Egyptian president, our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. President of Iraq, our goal is clear to wipe Israel off the map. So again, they're facing the same kind of existential threat that they had been facing in 1948. And I do think it's really important to realize that a lot of times people will consider that this was an offensive war on Israel's part, that Israel was the one, because they launched the first actual strike against Egypt's army, they will say that Israel was the one that started this war. But it's really important to realize that actually Egypt started the war by blocking the access to the Straits of Tiran. That is considered an active war. And we're going to see in a moment why that distinction is really important for us to remember. So in 6 days, less than a week, Israel managed to make major territorial gains. Israel gained the entire Sinai Desert from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. For the first time in almost 20 years, Jewish people could access the Kotel because the Western Wall was in East Jerusalem, which was in this part that had been taken over by Jordan. And when Israel took it back, it's also, I think, important to note, Israel did not do anything to harm Muslim holy sites, Christian holy sites in the way that the Jordanians had done. Everyone was free to access and to pray at their own holy sites in East Jerusalem. Everything was open access for all people. So Israel gained a lot of territory. And the reason I was saying that it's important to understand that Israel did not start the war, even though it kind of looked like they did, is because, as we said before, a country cannot expand its borders in an offensive war. So if Israel had started this war and had then gained all of this territory, it would be an automatically clear situation that they would have to give it back. Of course, that doesn't always mean that countries do. As we saw, Jordan and Egypt did not give back the land that they had gained, although it's not so clear that they even gained it from. It's a very complicated kind of legal situation. And actually, as Irina and I were speaking about before we started, I do have a whole kind of 1-hour session specifically on this land that was gained in the 6-day war, often referred to as the disputed territories, or incorrectly as the occupied territory. So if anyone's interested in learning more about the details of this and the legalities and the history, then I think if you let Rena know after the session, we can maybe book another presentation specifically on this, because I kind of could talk about it again for a whole hour, but we do have to move on. But it is significant that Israel gained this territory in a defensive position, not in an offensive position. And that doesn't mean that they can automatically keep it, but it's more of a kind of, there are different opinions on what happens if you gain territory in a defensive war, but it's definitely not the opinion that you absolutely have to give it back. It gets even more complicated here, as someone mentioned in the chat. Who would they be giving it back to? No one really had the rights to this to this land. And as I can go into in my other presentation, while there's no kind of clear-cut answer as to whose land it was or it should be, I think the strongest legal argument is that the land should have belonged to Israel, just according to strictly kind of the legal basis. But again, we don't have time to get too much into it, unfortunately. And Israel actually offered to give back a lot of the territory that it gained right away. Pretty much a week after the war ended, they went to the United States and they said they were prepared to give a lot of the land back to Egypt specifically, and they didn't really get an answer from the Arab world. And as we're going to see in a moment, they sort of got an answer in a different way. So that brings us to the Khartoum Conference in 1967. This conference took place a few months after the Six-Day War and after Israel had offered to give back a lot of the land. The major Arab leaders of the time got together, the Arab League, and they established an official position when it comes to dealing with Israel. Their position is that the lands are Arab lands, so they belong to the Arabs, and that it's up to the whole Arab world to regain the land from the Jewish people. Their policy was no peace. They issued what's known as the 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. So that was sort of the answer that Israel was getting to their offer of giving back land that they had gained in exchange for peace. They said, we are not interested in making peace with you and recognizing you as a legitimate country or in negotiating with you. As we're going to see, some of the countries have gone back on this in more recent years, which is great. But at the time, this was the policy of the Arab world. They also said the insistence on the rights of the Palestinian people in their own country. So basically saying that that the country had been a Palestinian country or should be, and that it belonged to the Palestinians. And as we went through in our last session, that is definitely not based in any historical fact. There had never been an independent Palestinian country in the land. There had just been different peoples who were living there. And yeah, so that's the Khartoum Conference. It's also, I don't have a slide on this, but it is also relevant to note that the UN came out with UN resolution, I'll just go back, 242, shortly after this time, where they said that Israel should return territories that they gained in this war, and that in exchange, they need to receive basically peace with countries who they're giving land over to. And people will often cite Resolution 242 as saying that Israel has to give back the land that they gained. But what they don't mention is that, the countries that want to receive the land have to make peace with Israel. And we'll see in a minute that when countries were willing to make peace with Israel, Israel was willing to make concessions according to Resolution 242, but that they go together, the two conditions, the peace and the end of conflict with each other and the giving over of land. So you can't really be expected to have one without the other. So even though the Arab world did have the 3 no's in the Khartoum Conference and said that they were not willing to make peace with Israel, a couple of countries later on sort of changed their tune. So Egypt became the first Arab country to make peace with Israel in 1979. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Sadat signed the peace treaty. And not all Egyptians were happy with this. Sadat was actually assassinated, probably as a result of this. But in exchange for peace, Israel returned all the land that they gained in the Six-Day War from Egypt. So they didn't return Gaza because, remember, Gaza had never rightfully belonged to Egypt. So Egypt didn't really have a basis to say that would have to be returned to them. But they did give back the entire Sinai Desert. They gave it over to Egypt, as Resolution 242 recommended. If one side is willing to have an end to hostilities and to have peace, the other side should be willing to give back land. And that is what happened here. About 15 years after that, Jordan followed, and Jordan made peace with Israel as well. This was under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Jordan didn't get back the West Bank or Judea and Samaria because, again, it had never rightfully been theirs. They didn't really have any grounds to claim that they should have that land returned to them. In fact, sometime in the mid-80s, they actually renounced their claim to it. But what Jordan did receive in exchange for peace with Israel is that they have control over some of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem. So, for example, the Temple Mount, the security there and kind of the administration, that's under Jordanian control. So while they didn't get the land back, they did get authority over their or the Muslim holy sites in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Then we get to the Oslo Accords. And again, this is a major part of my hour-long session on the disputed territory. So I apologize, but this is going to be just sort of an overview given our time constraints. But the Oslo Accords were a set of agreements made between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the kind of Palestinian movement that came into being in the early 1960s. And their agreement was such that Israel would withdraw from territory in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in order to give self-government to the Palestinians. And what they did was they drew up a map based on where people were living. So no one had to move as a result of these accords. They drew up a map based on where people were living and divided up control of the region. So wherever Jewish people had been living, that became Area C, and that was under full Israeli control. There were also, I believe, about 5% of the Palestinians in the region also were living in Area C. And again, we can get way more into that if we do another session on it. But the vast majority of Palestinians were now under the Palestinian Authority, which was basically the kind of the political organization that came out of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in order to have the power in these regions that were now under Palestinian autonomous control. And there were two different kind of levels to this autonomy. So in Area A, which you can see are the darker brown areas. So those areas were under full Palestinian Authority control. There was absolutely no Israeli presence there. Israeli soldiers were not allowed to go there. No Israeli presence whatsoever. The Palestinians were in charge of kind of civil administration, schools, healthcare, anything like that. And they were also in charge of courts, of policing, of anything to do with control over life and civil. Okay, I'll just repeat. So in Area B, there was kind of a combination where the civil administration was run by the Palestinian Authority. So any kind of day-to-day life was under the Palestinian Authority control, but security was run both by the IDF and the Palestinian Authority. So they kind of coordinated in Area B. And Area B was sort of in kind of the transition zones between Area A and C, or in the more remote areas where you can see this kind of yellow. That was Area B. And the point of the Oslo Accords was sort of a trial or a basis for further negotiations. They said, we're going to try this out. We're going to give you limited self-government and self-control, and this is going to be a 5-year plan. And then at the end of the 5 years, we'll get back together. We'll see how things are going. And from there, we will we'll hopefully work on more permanent agreements, whether that's a two-state or autonomy. That was going to be the basis for further negotiations. And important to note, one of the offer or sort of one of the conditions of the Oslo Accords was that the Palestinian Authority would be responsible for putting a stop to terrorism. There had been a lot of terrorism coming out of what became Area A, and the Palestinian Authority was supposed to arrest the terrorists, put a stop to the terrorist activities. And So that was a 5-year plan. 5 years later, we have the Camp David meetings. And this was when Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak to come up with a plan again after Oslo. And Israel made several offers at this time in Camp David to the Palestinians. Ultimately, the final offer was a state in 100% of the Gaza Strip and in 94% of the West Bank. They would have a shared capital in East Jerusalem. And that was, a major offer that Israel put on the table, and Yasser Arafat rejected it. He did not offer any counter offers or proposals of his own. He just kept on rejecting whatever Israel would offer. And there are accounts from President Clinton at the time, who was, very upset with him and basically put all of the blame on Yasser Arafat for why the Camp David meetings basically ended as a failure. There was no agreement reached at the time. And so Oslo sort of just became the status quo. It wasn't supposed to last for more than 5 years, but they didn't really ever come up with anything to move things forward. Not only did Yasser Arafat reject Israel's offers for a Palestinian state, but when he got back to Ramallah, he launched the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was a 5-year period where there were daily riots in the Palestinian areas. Intifada means an uprising. So there were daily riots in the Palestinian towns and cities, often using human shields, leading to a lot of casualties. Very difficult time. And terrorism was primarily coming from Area A. I believe the number is about 75% of the attacks were launched by or were committed by people who had come into Israel from Area A of the West Bank, which was again under full Palestinian control. And at the time, there was no security barrier. There was nothing standing in between the areas that were Palestinian controlled and the areas that were Israeli controlled. So innocent people, but also terrorists, could just walk back and forth with nothing stopping. Coming from Area A, I believe the number is about 75% of the attacks were launched by or were committed by people who had come into Israel from Area A of the West Bank, which was again under full Palestinian control. And at the time, there was no security barrier. There was nothing standing in between the areas that were Palestinian controlled and the areas that were Israeli controlled. So innocent people, but also terrorists, could just walk back and forth with nothing stopping them. And when, again, the PA were supposed to put a stop to terror. They were supposed to be controlling it. And in reality, it was the complete opposite. They even had their own, was called the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, their own wing of the Palestinian Authority that was actually committing these terror attacks. So Israel eventually decided that they could not honor Oslo anymore in staying out of Area A, because the Palestinians were not honoring their side of the deal and stopping terror. So they actually went back in, they established a presence again in Area A and Area B or they already had a presence in Area B, but in Area A of the West Bank, they set up checkpoints to stop terrorists from moving around freely. They went and destroyed weapons factories and arrested terrorists. And they started constructing the security barrier, which is something that we hear a lot about. It's often called the apartheid wall on social media or in different contexts. And I think it's worth talking about for a minute that there's a few things that are wrong with that or that are incorrect about what people say. So first of all, 95% of it is a fence, not a wall. We always see these pictures of this huge, concrete wall. And while that is true of about 5%, just because of how close those areas are to Israeli roads and villages and towns that they need a wall. And that's an unfortunate reality, but really the vast majority, 95% of it is a fence. And it's not, to call it a wall is just not accurate. This security barrier is often, spoken about as a way that Israel tries to, enforce apartheid or keep out the Palestinians. And what's important to realize is they only started building it in 2002 after when they were in the middle of the Intifada. So it was not something that Israel immediately decided, we need a separation, we need to keep these people out. It was as a result of over 400 Israeli deaths in the year 2002, right before they started building the wall. And the number went down by over 90% when the wall was finished, or the barrier was finished. So I think it's just important for context to understand the reasoning behind having this security barrier there. And that's not to say that it isn't an inconvenience or it doesn't cause economic difficulties or different problems for the innocent Palestinians who are affected by it. And that's very unfortunate. But I do think the context is really important in terms of weighing, why does this even exist? And so just a couple of more recent things that we'll talk about, and then we'll open it up to questions. So in 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was very much on the right wing of Israeli politics, he made the decision to unilaterally disengage from Gaza. So he said, we are going to pull out all Israeli troops. All Israeli civilians, over 9,000, were forcibly evicted from their homes in the Gaza Strip. They had been living there. And they were told that they had to leave, and Israel was going to hand over complete control of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority. This was a unilateral move. There were no peace negotiations or kind of concessions on the Palestinian side. Israel did this as sort of a very bold attempt to improve their security situation and their prospects at peace. As I think most of us know, it didn't work out that way, but it was an attempt. In 2005, the land came under the control of the Palestinian Authority, but by 2006, Hamas, which is a terror organization whose mission and goal is to destroy Israel and to have the entire region of Israel be free of Jews and be an Arab state. You can find this in their constitution online if anyone wants some fun reading material. But in 2006, they won the majority of the elections in the Gaza Strip. And by 2007, they had murdered every remaining Palestinian Authority politician, meaning that they were now the only ones in control of the Gaza Strip. Since then, they have been basically running a dictatorship out of the Gaza Strip, sending rockets into Israel on and off for the past 12 years, building tunnels to send terrorists over the border into Israel, and overall just creating a very difficult security situation for Israelis. The one sort of semi-positive thing that came out of this is that Abbas, who is the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, he is scared that the Hamas will take over there too. And in fact, that's probably why he canceled their most recent elections that were supposed to take place. Polls were showing that Hamas was going to win. And because the Palestinian Authority and Israel sort of have this joint interest in not letting Hamas take over in the West Bank, they have been able to kind of have increased security coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, which has allowed Israel to, again, kind of move back out of Area A. They're not fully out like they were in 1993, but to sort of give more control back to the PA because they both really need to keep Hamas under control. So just to review and then bring up one kind of newer situation, again, looking forward, towards sort of why isn't there peace? Why are there not two states? Why are we still in this state of conflict or even war? So we spoke about 1937. There was a two-state solution that was rejected by the Palestinians. I put here Jews accept that. That's not really, some Jews accepted, not all Jews accepted. In 1947, the UN partition plan This time the Jews did accept it and the Arabs rejected it again and instead launched the War of Independence, trying to take over the entire country. In 1967, we had the 3 no's, the Khartoum Conference resolution. In 2008, we had the Camp David meetings where, as we said, Ehud Barak offered a Palestinian state in 100% of Gaza and in 94% of the West Bank. We have another offer, which we haven't spoken about yet, and then we'll just finish up with one more thing and then we'll be done. But in 2008, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert makes another offer for a 2-state solution to Mahmoud Abbas. This time he offers 100% of the West Bank. There would be, I think it was 4 or 6% land swaps, meaning that the major Israeli settlement blocks where there are Israeli communities living, those Area C communities would remain under Israeli control, but they would get the equivalent land within the rest of Israel that would now become under Palestinian control. So effectively, they would have 100% of the West Bank under their control. Gaza couldn't be offered at this point because it had already been given over to them and then they lost control. But the entire West Bank was being offered to the Palestinians for their own state. And once again, they rejected. This time, Mahmoud Abbas never even actually officially responded. He just sort of ignored the offer. So I just kind of bring up this reminder at the end so that I think it's important that we have in our minds, the lack of peace. Neither side is perfect, for sure. It's not like Israel is just willing to give the Palestinians everything they want, and the Palestinians are, but I do think that when the blame is often placed squarely on Israel's shoulders for the lack of peace or the lack of a Palestinian state, I think it's really important that we realize how many offers have been made and how many times the Palestinians have rejected and what this kind of maybe says about their intentions in terms of a 2-state solution, and specifically the leadership. So that's just kind of a reminder of that. And then to finish off on a more positive note, after this, we will open it up to questions, but I just wanted to I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but in the year 2020 alone, so we spoke about how Jordan made peace with Egypt, decades ago. And
Israel, you mean?
with Israel. And since then, Israel had not made peace with any of its Arab neighbors. And in the year 2020 alone, Israel made peace with 6 countries, five Arab or Muslim countries. And I think that this is something, that we can definitely celebrate and hope to see more of. It definitely signifies a shift in the Arab world, away from the Khartoum conference, away from the 3 no's. Definitely not, all Arab countries or all Muslim countries, but this is definitely something positive and a shift in the right direction for Israel. So just very quickly to let everyone know about some of the other programs that we have, if anyone has children or grandchildren or friends who might be interested in getting more involved and learning more about Israel and more involved in Israel advocacy. We have a high school internship program, which I run for high school students across North America. And we also have a campus fellowship, which is for students on college and university campuses in North America. So when it comes to high school, we have a program where students have a lot of interactive workshops, webinars, lots of guest speakers. They have a discount on the Hasbara Israel training program, which I'll get to in a moment. And they really just learn a lot of skills and knowledge that they will be able to use while they're in high school, and that will allow them to go as leaders into their university or college campuses. And we have the campus fellowship, which begins with a 2.5-week trip to Israel, where students learn on the ground. They get to speak to all sorts of experts and everyday people all across the political spectrum, the religious spectrum, people who are Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, and really just get a really, really solid understanding of what's going on there from the ground. And then they're able to come back to campus and really be leaders in their local Israel movement. So I'll put the details in the chat if anyone is interested. But for now, I think I'll stop sharing and we'll move on to questions.
So before you do, Pearl, for everybody who is interested in these elements, we will make sure that there's a follow-up email to today's presentation, and all of these details will be included. Sorry about the issues with the recording. It was a memory problem, but we're going to get that sorted out. before we do open it up to questions, there's a couple of interesting points that you made, Pearl, that I think that we should highlight. The use of language such as apartheid and the wall, which evoke other political situations where they are trying to create a false parallel between Israel and, for example, the apartheid of South Africa and the suggestion of racism, which is an inaccurate comparison. And the other thing, talking about the wall, which is suggesting the Berlin Wall and correlating to the old communist regime, and creating all of these suggestions of a political situation which is totally inaccurate. But slowly they're trying to use these words continuously that they change our way of viewing the situation. So be very careful about using the A word, because it's a false comparison. And a couple of questions that people had asked me that I want to make sure that we cover today. The correlation between Hamas and Hezbollah is because they are religious extremists compared to the Palestinian Authority, which is not a religious sponsored organization, which is another reason for the conflict between the PA, which is in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And finally, Pearl, if you could give a little context on Sheikh Jarrah, because this is what provoked the most recent, or which was allegedly what provoked the most recent uproar, which I think was just a smokescreen for what was actually happening.
Absolutely. I'm just going to look. We actually have, we put together sort of a document, which I will share with everyone, that goes really into detail about Sheikh Jarrah, but I will definitely try to give sort of a summary, but let me just put in the chat. Let me just put this in the chat so that everyone has it for later.
Okay. And I'll also make sure that we send all of this to everybody. So don't worry if you don't catch it now.
Okay. So yeah, so Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in Jerusalem. It's been a while since this is like in the news kind of a few months ago. I spoke about it a lot, and it's been a little bit of a while since then. And yeah, so it's a neighborhood of Jerusalem, which has, there's been a legal dispute going on in the neighborhood for decades. And recently it sort of caught the attention of the international media because it was the final decision was going to the Supreme Court. And what was kind of the cause for the dispute? So there was land that had been purchased in the late 1800s. As we spoke about, much of the land was purchased by Jewish organizations and Jewish funds at the time. And they purchased the land that became Sheikh Jarrah from Arab owners. According to Jews, it was called Shimon HaTzadik. That was the name of the neighborhood because there was a grave there from one of the Kohanim, the high priests from the when the temple was around, called Shimon HaTzadik, and he's buried there. And there were three neighborhoods kind of that all sort of coexisted. There were two Arab neighborhoods and a Jewish neighborhood, Shimon HaTzadik. One of the Arab ones was called Sheikh Jarrah, and they sort of coexisted there. And Jews had been living in that area until they were kicked out in the 1948 war. So as we spoke about, when the land came under Jordanian control, they evicted all of the Jewish residents out of the land. And they seized their property. And in the 1950s, the Jordanians built houses on the land that had been owned by Jews, and they gave it to Palestinian Arabs to live on. Some of the land, they actually transferred ownership. They gave the Palestinians land deeds, land titles, but some of them they did not. They just said, you can live here and eventually maybe we'll give you ownership, but for now you can just kind of live here. And when Israel regained control of Jerusalem, or gained control of Jerusalem in 1967, they passed a law that land that had been taken from Jewish owners who were kicked out could be returned to the Jewish owners on two conditions. If the Jewish owners could actually prove ownership, so they couldn't just say, I used to live here or my parents used to live here, they had to prove ownership. And the land was not now legally owned by Palestinians or by Arabs. So the land that Jordan had actually transferred ownership to Palestinians, Jews, even if they had been the rightful owners, they were not allowed to take back that land, only if no one rightfully owned it anymore and it had been theirs. So if the residents couldn't prove their own ownership over the land. And so again, where Jordan gave ownership to the Palestinians, that was respected by Israel, even though the land had been stolen from the Jews, sorry. But where the Palestinians could not prove their own ownership, that was where the Jews said, you now have to leave, and the land goes back to the Jewish owners. And in 1982, there was a Jewish organizations who owned the land, and they took the Palestinian residents of a few properties to court. They wanted to evict them. They said, this is our land and we want the Palestinians to leave. And the court found that, yes, the properties were rightfully owned by Jews and the Palestinians living there did not own the land, but they were protected tenants. It was kind of like squatters' rights. They had been living there for so long that they couldn't be evicted, but they would have to pay rent because the land, again, was owned by the Jews. The Palestinians were living there and had the right to continue being protected there, but they had to pay rent because they were living in someone else's property. And so basically the residents, as long as they agreed to pay rent, would not be evicted from the properties. They signed an agreement saying that they would pay rent and things sort of quieted down. But then about 10 years later, they were taken back to court because they had not been paying their rent and they had also been building illegally on the land. And so because they hadn't been paying rent, they were no longer considered protected. Also, some of them were no longer protected because they were not the original people who had been living there. They were like their descendants, or they were living somewhere else and keeping the land. So for various reasons, I think there were 8 different people involved in the case. None of them still qualified as protected tenants. Since then, there have been so that was in 93. Since then, there have been lots of kind of trials going back and forth to the court. The Palestinian residents keep bringing different kind of arguments, saying they do have ownership or different arguments for each one. So it kind of keeps going back into the court systems, which is why, almost 20 years later, they still haven't been evicted, and it still keeps going back to the courts. And so the Supreme Court was set to come out with a decision that they were going to have to be evicted, but they ended up delaying the decision because this is the key. So as Rena mentioned, it was sort of used as an excuse for the uprising of Arab violence that we saw a few months ago. But the decision was delayed because there had already been violence. So the violence wasn't as a result of the decision. The decision, as far as I know, didn't even come out. I haven't heard anything about the final decision being publicized. Right. There was all of this violence that started during Ramadan. Ramadan is always a time of heightened tensions in Israel. Whenever Israelis, I spoke to several Israelis at the time and said like, oh, so they're saying that it's because of the Sheikh Jarrah. And they're like, what are you talking about? We know that Ramadan is going to be a time of violence. It's always a time of increased tensions and violence. So the timing just wasn't great for this case. Which is why Israel tried to avoid kind of the drama by delaying it, but it didn't work.
But yeah, just as a reminder, Ramadan is 1 month where, we fast for 1 day on Yom Kippur. Ramadan is a month of fasting, which often does have some violent outcomes and it's quite an unsettling time as well.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things that are important to realize with this Sheikh Jarrah situation is that, first of all, constantly around the world, everywhere in our neighborhoods, there are always disputes between landlords and tenants and evictions going on. These are things that happen when people are tenants. So the fact that, it's normal for a tenant to be evicted when they're not paying rent to their landlord. So the fact that this became this major issue sort of already should kind of make people question, what's going on here. It was presented in the media as Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians. They were saying that Israel had special laws that, favor Jews over Palestinians. None of this is true. This is simply
use of
it has nothing to do with the Israeli government. Right. It's the language. It has nothing to, people were saying Israel's policy of ethnic cleansing. This has nothing to do with the Israeli government. This was private landowners and private tenants in court. nothing to do with any Israeli policy or Israeli government decision. They had nothing to do with it. So it's very important to kind of question what we're hearing and try and figure out, are things accurate? Is the language accurate? And then Hamas jumped on this kind of bandwagon of people already being upset at Israel and used it as a time to then launch rockets, which turned into the major conflict that we've been experiencing, or that Israelis have been experiencing over the past few months. All of the timing sort of just converged to be very convenient for Hamas to take over. So that is Sheikh Jar. If anyone has further questions about that, please feel free to put them in the chat. Rena, did you receive any questions, or do we want to just open it up?
I think we can open it up. We're a little bit over time. So perhaps what we can do, you all have my email address, and you can definitely send me the questions, which I'm happy to share with Pearl, and we can get back to you. Let's just maybe have a quick peek in the chat if we can take one or two questions now. Do you want to open it up, Pearl, to look at the chat?
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Not really seeing questions.
I think it's mostly just people making comments, because there's quite a lot of information that's concentrated here. And maybe when people receive the materials, it will solicit questions and they can get back to us. There's another point that is interesting to note, and I think it's important that people understand this. The tenants were not being asked for some unreasonable amount of money. It was a symbolic amount. I think it was like 1 dinar, like less than $1 a year, but just as a way of showing that they were recognizing the actual Jewish ownership. So it wasn't like they were being asked for an unreasonable amount of money to be paid.
Do we want to allow people to raise their hands like last time and unmute?
Yes.
Now? Okay, so if anyone wants to use the raise hand button, if you go to reactions on the bottom right, and then you can click raise hand, and then you can unmute.
And I would like to say something with respect to the launching the rockets by Hamas. It was a political thing to show the citizens that it was only Hamas, not the PA, who was looking out for their rights. And I think that was one of the reasons Abbas decided not to hold elections, because he knew he was going to lose because he didn't have public opinion behind him.
Absolutely, totally true. Thank you. I see a question in the chat. How does it affect the everyday lives? Sarah, do you want to just clarify, how does what affect the everyday lives?
Okay, so Hamas is in control of Gaza, correct?
Yes.
This is complicated because I've been researching and studying this and thinking.
It is definitely complicated.
My little research cap or whatever. So they control the everyday lives. Now, here's the thing that interests me. For example, the media relations campaign to sell us on the image of the Palestinians and the evil, big, bad Israel. It's a powerful campaign. It's doing very, very well. It's fantastic. I mean, it's got a market share of 95%, I'd say at this point. They're doing great. Whoever's backing it is brilliant, right? So I think this plays into Hezbollah. It plays into other countries that might be hostile. I don't understand the nature of these countries and so on, like Iran and so on and so forth. But to get back to the Palestinians, there's a few speculations. Like, for example, have you heard of the concept of Hollywood?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a sense of the staged scenes where they take the same woman and they bring her different backdrops and she cries. The reporters come in, they know exactly what's going on, the Western reporters. They don't care though, I guess they're just getting the stripes and getting out. So they come in, they know nothing, they get dined and wined and told great things by these Palestinians, they have a great image. The same thing happens to the activists, in my opinion, right? And then, including, I have a friend, he does stupid shit, a journalist, he goes there by himself to hang out with Palestinians and stuff. It's crazy, it's not even safe. Okay, and he tells me this shit. So the issue I'm having is the concept of like, I mean, stuff with your children, right? They say, you just killed our children. Now, not to mention the fact that 1/3 of the rockets, I think, landed within Gaza by mistake. And they launched them from schools and hospitals and stuff. But it goes deeper than that, right? Like, what's the nature of everyday life among the Palestinians? Like, who's lived with him and can say that. Like my cousin Hirsch was talking about that. There's some jihadists, for example, and what's a jihadist family like, and what is the nature of jihadism? And I think Rena was getting to that. And I think the issue we have as Jews is jihadism, I think, is at odds with our value system diametrically. They want to have a unified pan-Arab state. They want everything for themselves. The Palestinians I've read are just a prop. They're like a tool, the edge of the wedge to get in to take over all the land. And they want our land too. It's our land. They're Arabian. They have nothing to do with the Philistines. That's nonsense. So, I mean, how does this affect the everyday people? And are they being manipulated and used? How does this affect domestic violence? How does this affect nutrition? The educated heard about their textbooks?
This is a topic for, this is definitely a very meaty topic, and we could absolutely have a whole other session just on this question alone. How does religious fundamentalism affect the politics within the Palestinian context? Yeah. So I think that, Pearl and I are going to sit down and we're going to come up with some follow-up questions for you. We will send you a survey of things that you're interested in finding out more about. And this fall, this course will be repeated, but then we're going to offer a whole variety of other sessions to follow up. So we would appreciate your feedback. You've put out some wonderful points. And Pearl, thank you so much for your dedication and providing such an in-depth and thorough overview of the situation.
You're welcome. And Sarah, those are really great questions. And again, so in my presentation on the disputed territories, we go into all of that. What has been the impact on the lives of Palestinians?
Look, I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm a graduate of the universities, etc. I'm not at that stage right now. I don't mean to be mean or anything, but I just want to say, Rena, what you just said, like, I felt like I just finally won the lottery. I'm so happy. So please, send out your surveys,
Yeah, absolutely. Because first of all, none of these courses can take place without having people attend them. And we want to be able to fill that knowledge gap so that you feel you can take charge in these kind of discussions. There's nothing more frustrating to feel like we're under attack and we don't have the answers. Right. We want to be able to provide you with the answers and the context so that you can take charge and feel that you have something valuable to contribute when you're in conversations with friends and peers and colleagues.
Maybe we could get some of the market share back from their back. We can get to 10% market share in 3 months.
Why not?
We'll work on it. We'll work on it.
I want to just thank you all. Thank you, Pearl. Thanks to all of our partners and to all of you. And we will be sending out a survey in the next while. So thanks again. Thank you so much. And thanks, Robert, for helping us with all the technical side today.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thanks again.